Right then, you stinky sea dogs, flip your phone landscape so you can see this in full view, because today I have something special for you. Proper exciting stuff. I've teamed up with Dehancer, you know, the absolute legends of film emulation, and we've designed a cheeky giveaway and a cheeky discount code because I'm nice like that. Now, before you start throwing your names into Goblet of Fire, we're gonna have a wee look into Dehancer, because trust me, you're gonna wanna know why this stuff is worth your time. But little disclaimer, the only stipulation in place for this video is that Dehancer have no say over my opinions of this plugin. So if it's shit, I'm gonna say that it's shit. However, I must say it seems pretty decent so far, so stick around to learn about the giveaway. It might be right now, might be in the middle, or it might be at the end, because algorithm, motherfuckers. Right, so as you can see on your screens, I've gone ahead and prepared a basic node tree for how I feel this will best complement the Dehancer plugin. So the very first thing that we're going to go ahead and do is go into our effects tab, and we're going to have a look for Dehancer. I've already searched it up, so I'm going to just drag that onto this node here, and you can see that there's already some sort of a modification happening on our image. And right now it doesn't look very good. If you were to just drag this on and think, oh well, that's it, done, you'd be very wrong. There's a number of things that we need to change in terms of parameters, using the tools within the plugin to refine our look before we can go ahead and print it and deliver it to the client. So the first thing that I'm just going to go ahead and do is disable the film grain so we can get a more authentic rendition of the look profile itself. So as you can see, we've got a number of options. We've got our source material. This here, depending on our color management, our footage information, will best serve us to design our look. So within this specifically, I'm gonna have to choose my camera. And luckily for me, I know what the input information was. So when I go ahead and tweak this, I'll be choosing the camera option. But below that, we have a number of tools as well. We have exposure compensation, temperature comp, we have tint, defringe. Then beneath that, we have our film profile, the type of look that we want to develop and how much we want to push and pull that out of the final look. We have the film developer tool, which will allow us to control things like the contrast, correcting our gamma tint, how much color separation we want to integrate within this look, how much we want to boost the color as well. We have film compression, which I'm assuming will be to deal with things like highlight roll off. Then we have this expand tool, and just off first glances it says black and white point, so I'm guessing that also deals with shadows and highlights. Then we have the print section of what film stock we want to print this on, whether it's the Fujifilm 3513 or the Kodak 2383, the analog range limiter, which will give us a little bit more breathing room when it comes to the shadows and the highlights. And then there's a number of other tools. But right, let's go ahead and actually play around with this. So my overall first thoughts is there's a lot of things that it presents you with, and it can feel a little bit overwhelming. You might not necessarily be able to develop a good understanding of all of the integrated tools from just first glance, but just like when you first moved over to DaVinci and had to learn how to color grade, we're going to take this step by step, and we're going to see how quickly we can grasp what each tool does and how we can develop a pretty nice looking film emulation. The first thing that I'm going to do is set my camera input information, and this footage from this fashion campaign that I worked on, provided by my friend and director Naz Abraham. I know for a fact that this was shot on a Sony, and I believe it was the Sony a7S III. So I'm going to go ahead and choose camera, and then when I go into vendor, it opens up a number of options. So now Apple is an interesting one, considering the amount of progress that they've made with their Apple log ProRes weird combination thing that they have going on for their phones. So you can go ahead and download the iOS plugin for your phone or for your iPad and tweak the footage straight out of the camera, which I think is a really cool additive, and I'm interested to see how much push and pull we have with that. But anyway, you have Arri, Blackmagic, Canon, Fujifilm, Panasonic, Red, Sony. I'm going to go ahead and choose Sony, and now you can see that it starts to normalize, but it hasn't gone ahead and done the entire job just yet because we've got a few other parameters to set. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the camera, which I believe is the a7S III, and then I'm going to switch this to S-Log 3, Gamma Cine 3. Just from first impressions, it feels quite punchy when it comes to the contrast and the shadows and the dark points. I really love what it's doing with the skin. I often struggle to develop this type of natural density when I'm dealing with darker skin models for projects that I'm working on. So the fact that it's having this type of an effect on our model, this is fucking awesome for me. But right, let's go ahead and see what film profiles we have. So if I just scroll up to the top, you can see that we have the Agfa profiles, a number of them. We have Cine Still, we have Fuji, whether it's Fuji Chrome, whether it's Eterna, and I'd be really interested to see how that works with the new Eterna camera that Fujifilm are releasing. Moving on, we have Instax, Neopan, we have HPS, so we have some black and white emulations here as well. We have Ektar, Kodak Gold, Portra, Vision 3, Loma Chrome, a whole bunch of different options. And from the research that I've been doing recently, if I just go over onto my shot deck, for example, I've created a little mini deck within shot deck for certain film profiles and emulations that were created for the big screen that I have been really enjoying. For instance, we have Queen and Slim, which is one of my favorite films. So if you look down here, we have Vision 3 500T. We also have Vision 3 250D, which we already have built in within Dehancer. If we go over to Black Klansman, we again have Vision 3 250D, Vision 3 500T. If I go over to the ASAP Rocky project, again, this is Vision 3, this time it's 200T. Taking a look at something like, I don't know, let's take a look at Man on Fire. Right, so this one's a little bit different. So we do have the 500T, but it's the expression format. Then we have the 200T. We also have color reversal 160D and color reversal 100D. So there's a few formats in this that are slightly different, but you can see it gives you a good baseline of understanding what type of film profiles they use. And then when we navigate back to DaVinci, based on that information that we've just seen, I'm gonna go ahead and select either, let's see what 200T looks like. Okay, so this is what 200T would give us as a baseline, and what would 500T give us? Because this is a fashion project and I do want it to feel slightly warmer, not completely, I just want it to have some warm characteristics. I'm gonna go ahead and just leave it at 500T for now, which seems to be a pretty popular choice. The next thing that I'm gonna go ahead and do is choose my film print profile. And let's see what it looks like when I first go for Fujifilm, interesting, and then Kodak. So with this being a Kodak film profile, I think I'm gonna stick with the Kodak print as well. So now when I'm looking at this footage, there's a number of things that I want to work on. I feel like if I take a look at the scopes, the very bottom and the darkest parts of this feel like they're being choked quite a bit. So I think I'm gonna have to do some playing around with contrast and exposure to be able to just get a little bit more range out of that. And then again, when I'm looking at this, even the black points feel a little bit too faded for my liking. I think I wanna lift up the gamma just to bring our model out a tiny bit and play around with the density of some of the other tones, whether it's the shoes, whether it's the yellows on these little posts, even playing around with the color tint that we're getting on this wall. So there's a number of things that I want to do, but the very first thing that I'm gonna go ahead and do before I start playing with any of these parameters is I'm just gonna set my white balance. So I'm gonna go ahead and change the gamma to linear. Just close this effects tab, drop the Luma mix, and then now when I take my gain, this feels a little bit more yellow, red, and then we have a little bit of magenta here. So I'm just gonna kind of go into the opposite direction just to take a little bit out of that. Still want a bit of that magenta in there, not too much of it. I just start to neutralize this a tiny bit. I'm quite happy with that. So now if I go back into this, let's see what the temperature compensation does as well. So I can then go ahead and add a little bit more heat into it should I want to, but then again, naturally I would be drawn to do that within a look adjustment node. So I'm not too sure how good that's going to work within this. We can play around with the temperature, either cooling it off or warming it up. We're going to reset that. We can also play around with the tint. We can add a little bit more green, or we can lean into the magenta. And again, my natural response would be to do this within printer lights within a separate node, but I'm just trying to get a feel to see what this plugin can actually offer. So contrast boost, if I go ahead and boost this contrast, it's not going to work because I don't have it enabled. So now once it's enabled, if I go ahead and boost this contrast, you can see that it's really impacting all of the darker regions of this image, and I'm not a massive fan of what it's doing to the skin tones because it's not really giving me any juice here. So I'm just going to reset that. Gamma correction doesn't seem to have any visible differences just from the jump. So I'm just gonna leave this section for film developer, and I'm gonna go straight into my expand point first. I'm gonna take the black point, I'm just gonna give it a little bit more crunch, and I'm gonna take the white point and I'm just gonna introduce a little bit more high key highlights, which is what you'll often see with fashion-based projects. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the tonal contrast within my film print and I'm just going to expand that tiny bit just so it gives it a little lift. lift. I'm gonna take the color density and I'm just gonna push that a bit as well. Target whites, let's just bring that back, which will give me a slightly softer highlight roll off. So if I just disable that, you can see it's doing a lot. So if I just reset that, you can see prior to just bringing down the target white point within the film print section, it was not as soft. Keeping your eyes here, we're just softening that highlight roll off a tiny bit. And then what I'm gonna go ahead and do is, I feel like with this plugin, it's gonna be a back and forth. It's not just gonna be implement all of your choices within Dehancer and then go ahead and do everything else. I feel like it's gonna require a little bit more information and direction before it starts to have the result that I'm looking for. So the next thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into my exposure node and I'm gonna go into my HDR wheels, just start to see where I can take this exposure. So I'm gonna start with this shadow just to lift up the skin and the model. I'm gonna land maybe somewhere around about here, and that's gonna be half a stop. Then I'm gonna take this highlight and I'm just gonna try to bring that down a touch, maybe say somewhere around about here. And you can see we're already starting to get a little bit more information. So now when I play around with the contrast within this, it's gonna have a slightly more pleasing result. I'm also just gonna take, the highlights down a touch, and I'm just gonna lift up the gamma. I don't want to take the highlights down too far because I am looking for those high key highlights that are more reminiscent of fashion projects, but I am going to just give it a lift down here. And you can see it now feels like these darkest parts within our scopes aren't as choked as what they were when we first implemented Dehancer. So now I'm gonna go into my SAT and I need to switch this over to HSB, disable channel 1 and channel 3, and just give this image a little bit more juice, just so I can see what the colors are actually doing. I'm gonna land round about there, then I'm gonna go back into Dehancer. Now let's play around with the contrast boost. So if I just start to bring that contrast back up, and if I play around with the gamma correction, right now we're starting to get a little bit more. So from what I'm noticing, gamma correction affects this image on an exposure level opposed to a color level. So if I take the slider higher, we're gonna increase the exposure value. If I bring it down, naturally it's gonna reduce that exposure value. So I'm just gonna kind of leave it at around about the -15. Color separation, is that doing anything for me at the moment? No, it's not. Color boost, what happens? You can see it's having quite a strong effect when it comes to the shoes. If I give it a lift, we're getting an increase within the luminance. But if I decrease it, we're taking that saturation out of it, but it's also shifting the apparent density of these shoes. So for now, I'm just gonna leave it where it was. And then if I just zoom back out of this, let's go ahead and enable film compression and see what impact that has. If I take the impact slider, we're adding a little bit more juice into the highlights. White point again is going to affect the highlights. So whereas with its natural setting, we're feeling like we're maintaining the high key highlights, if I start to bring this down, I'm noticing it's softening the highlight roll off, and I don't necessarily want to do that too much. So I'm just going to reset that. Tonal range, you can see that it's starting to compress the colors a tiny bit more. Color density doesn't really seem to be doing much as of yet either. So now I'm gonna just go back into my expand point, and I'm just gonna take the black point and I'm just gonna give it a little bit more, just so it feels like there's a little bit more contrast in this image. Take that white point, just give it a slight lift by bringing it back. Maybe just land somewhere around about here. Then if I take the exposure value within the print section, you can see we are getting a nice soft rendition of that contrast. It does feel filmic, and I love the fact that it's adding a slight tint into the shadows as well, which is what would naturally happen when you're shooting on film. Like, your black points are not gonna look crystal clear. They're not gonna look pure. There's always gonna be a slight tint within them, which is what happens when you're shooting on film. So I love the fact that it's doing that naturally. If I take this tonal contrast, I really like what's happening here. Even with the color density, I'm gonna boost that color density just because I like the result it's having on the shoes. I'm not gonna pull back the saturation. Now, when I enable this analog range limiter, you're gonna see that it starts to feel a little bit more washed out, because what happens is, purpose of the analog range limiter within Dehancer is that it's used to control how much of this film emulation, the effects that come with that, such as contrast, saturation, halation, bloom, grain, so on and so forth, how much it applies to the different tonal ranges within this image, right? So it helps to preserve the highlights, it helps to preserve the shadow details whilst trying to maintain that natural and organic look. And the way that it's working is, when it comes to your shadows and highlights, it's preventing that excessive processing in the darkest parts and the brightest parts of the image. So it's keeping them from being overly affected by the film-like elements and effects. And it's also trying to develop a more natural film. Because when you think about real film, it has its limitations, right, in how it reacts to extreme tonal ranges. The limiter is going to ensure a more authentic emulation, or try to at least. And then it's also going to give you the capacity to be able to finesse your controls a little bit more, fine-tune them. You can adjust how much of this effect influences the midtones while going ahead and protecting your shadows and your highlights. That's what your analog range limiter is going to do. However, for me, because I've set the parameters to work outside of that analog range limiter with this specific look, I'm just going to disable that for now. So now I want to move into the color head section and see what happens. I'm going to take this red and I'm just going to start shifting it to see if I enable this tool first and foremost. I'm just going to take that red and see what happens. And I feel like it's pretty much just within the information that you have on screen, right? Like, I'm going to take this slider, and if I shift it to cyan, I feel like it's going to add more cyan into the image. Yep. And if I go to red, it's going to add more red. So what I can do is, because I just want to clean up a tiny bit of that magenta that's in the gravel down here. So I'm just going to take that red and I'm just going to there, and I'm still protecting these white points. I don't feel like there's an unbearable tint or color cast on the white parts of this image. So it feels quite nice. Then playing around with the magenta and the greens. I'm going to warm it up a slight touch. So I'm going to kind of land somewhere around about here. So if I just enable and disable this, it's a very subtle effect that it's having. I feel like it's just warmed everything up a tiny bit. I'm actually going to go ahead and add a little bit more blue range into this image. And for me, that feels good. So what would be nice, just looking at this color head, is if there was a skin tone slider here. When you're thinking about your shadows, midtones, highlights, those are nice parameters to be able to affect, but I'd also like to have a dedicated slider for the skin tones, just to be able to get a little bit more finite with certain areas that I want to affect. But taking the midtones, and I start to go backwards, it's cooling the midtones off, but that's also undoing the work that I've just done. If we play around with the shadows, we're gonna cool them off, or if we start going up, we're gonna warm them up slightly. So I mean, I'm pretty happy with what I've just done to the shadows. Take the highlights. Pretty cool that we can start to cool those highlights off or warm them up. I think for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to leave that where it is and then just see if there's anything else that I want to affect. So I'm pretty happy with where this has landed within the plugin itself, but there are a few other things that I want to do. So the very first thing that I want to do is play around with my contrast. So I'm going to go into my contrast curve. I'm going to make sure editable splines is not enabled, and the first thing that I'm going to do is just give this a slight lift, and then I'm going to start developing nice contrast curve, something that's soft, isn't too harsh. I don't want to go ahead and do too much. I do want to bring this highlight top end down. I like that. I like what's happening. And then within this BP node, which is for my black points, I'm just going to go into my log wheels and I'm just going to start bringing that down a touch just to give that a little bit more depth. And then what I am noticing is she is now starting to suffer from some of these choices, so I'm going to go back into the shadows and I'm just going to give that a lift, maybe just above half a stop. I'm going to take the highlights and I'm just going to bring them down because I do want a slightly softer roll off. Maybe going back into my primaries, just seeing what's happening here. I like that. Cool. So one thing I do want to do is I want to create a look adjustment node prior to my color slice. So what I am going to do is I'm just going to hit Shift and S to create a node before that, and then I'm going to take this as my look adjustment node. So we've created a look with Dehancer. I want to adjust it. So post plugin is where I'm going to do that, and I'm going to stick around within this offset. One thing that I'm not really feeling is the amount of magenta coming through, so I'm going to make sure I'm in my offset, and I'm going to go over to my printer lights, which you can find in color. Now, if you have memorized these numbers, you'll be able to just click, say, the 0 number instead of constantly having to go back here and draw out the color that you're trying to do. I also want to pull back some of the cyan that's coming through, but for the sake of showing you guys how this would work if you haven't, I'm going to just stick around with these functions. I might even go ahead and add a little bit more blue, take out another magenta, and just do before and after. Right. Slightly better. I like that. Moving into my color slice. I like the amount of density that is there, but this red is really messing with my eyes, so I'm gonna see if I can affect that. So now her skin tone is living within the red parameter. You see if I just add some of that red there. So I think the red in the shoes is probably gonna live within this skin tone. So yeah, I want to add more density there, but I also just want to pull back some of that saturation just so it's not too jarring. Bear in mind this is Sony S-Log footage, and the results that we're getting from this S-Log 3 footage is really impressive. And I mean, you'd be lying to yourself if you're saying that it's not, because just to show you guys, we've gone from this to this, which for me, creating that film look, this has saved me a bunch of time. I want to add a little bit more saturation into this yellow, so I'm just going to crank that up. Then I'm just going to add a little bit more density there. I want to see what the blues, so the blues are controlling those darkest parts. I'm going to add a little bit more saturation into that as well, and I quite like what's happening here. Right, so instead of having to go back into the exposure and try to lift her out a tiny bit more, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some masks. So the first mask that I'm going to do is one where we create this shape around her and angle it just so it kind of mimics the direction of the light and give it some softness, and then I'm going to invert that. So now if I go into my editable splines and start to bring that down, I like what that's doing, but I feel like there's a little bit more saturation in her skin than necessary, so I'm just going to go ahead and pull that back within my color slice. Again, just take out some of the red as well, maybe take out some of the blue in the background, and I am actually going to go ahead and give it a little bit more exposure within that gamma section, just take down some of the gain. Then the second mask that I'm going to create is for her face. I'm just going to kind of centralize that around there, bring this in from the sides, again give it some shape, give it some softness, and then I'm going to go ahead and track this. Because this is quite a short clip, I'm not really going to have to worry about movement or anything, but what I am going to do is I'm just going to take this bottom end, just give it a little lift, and you can see that she is now starting to come out from the background. And one thing I have noticed is when you use Dehancer, because Dehancer is going to try to recreate the effects of film, it is also going to soften this image. And if you use film quite often, you'll notice that film is quite soft. But with this being a fashion campaign and this being shot digitally, I do just want to bring back a little bit of focus just so it doesn't look like the shooter missed the focus. So I'm just going to take that and I'm just going to bring it down to about 47. You can see it's just bringing back a little bit that sharpness, which feels nice. And one thing I'm not feeling is this tint up here. So I'm going to go back into my look adjustment. I'm going to create a point here actually. Now, when I start to lift this up, just clean that up a tiny bit. Okay, cool, I prefer that. That's nicer. And there's other things that you can do. So for instance, if you want to go in and key the pink strips across the rugby shirt, you can go ahead and do that. But this looks nice. One thing I do want to try out with this, you can see there's a lot of noise within the shadows and it's being picked up within the scopes as well. So I do want to just see what happens if I use noise reduction and if it breaks this image or if it works in cohesion with this image. So I'm just going to go and do something quite soft, and it is taking out a lot of that noise. You can see especially down within these parade scopes here, before, after. So I mean, I'm pretty happy with the look that I've recreated. Prior to this look, the look that I created with Dehancer was this, which I also quite enjoy. It's a little bit cleaner. There's not as much of a tint within the walls. The shadows and contrast feel a little bit softer, but for the sake of just being able to show you guys the experiment a little bit more vividly, I've created a slightly punchier look, especially within that contrast element of this image, which is why it feels a little bit different to the original look that I created. But I am quite interested to see how this type of a look would translate over onto another clip. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a still and then I'm going to try transfer that over onto another clip within this sequence. Right, so I have a few clips. I have this one here, which is quite nice as well, to be honest. Then you have the one of all three of them in front of this blue background, which is also pretty cool. You have this from a slightly different angle, and then you have a hero shot of the actual product, which are the Nike Cortez. So I think I'm probably going to try this one first. So I'm going to open up this gallery and I'm just going to apply this grade. So initially, Right, let's just find a hero frame. Say, where's she in focus? End of the clip, we're gonna stick around here. Highlights are maxing out with this look, so we're gonna have to adjust the exposure. She's pretty well displayed. In terms of color, we're quite even in terms of the color profile itself and the look. There's a little bit more magenta in this wall than there was in this one, so we're gonna have to play around with it. Just coming back onto that hero frame, let's go into the exposure first and foremost, bring down the highlights, and then we're gonna have to compensate for that within the gamma. So with the exposure, we got there pretty quickly, nothing too drastic. I am gonna go into my saturation, try give it a little bit of a boost, maybe go back into Dehancer and see if we can play around with black and white points, taking the film developer, giving the overall image color boost. Awesome, pretty happy with that. What I am going to do is I'm going to go ahead and enable the grain. As you can see, the grain structure here is quite intense, but you do get a few profiles. You get 8mm, 16 and 35, and it's based on ISO. Yeah, going to stick with 500, and that's quite a lot, so I'm going to just go ahead and pull that back just so it's not overpowering and doesn't look artificial. Around about there is quite nice. And then going to that previous clip, if I just go back into this, I'm going to enable ISO there and go to 500, and again just pull that back, and you can see that it's randomizing its movement so it doesn't feel like you've just grabbed a grain overlay and stuck it on. And I really like how this plugin allows you to develop this film look. It's not overtly complicated, especially with the amount of color grading we do on this channel. It's not super complex to figure out how to use. I mean, there are a few elements within this that I feel like would just make this a little bit better. Color matching wise, I would have to go back in and match the wall a little bit better. Right now you have this yellow cyan tint here, whereas over here it's nice and uniform, it's magenta, feels nicer to look at. So color matching, you'd probably have to go in and do a little bit of work, but just developing a look pretty quickly and to the quality of what it's given us has been simple. It's not been very complex. So for me, just playing around with this for the very first time, I think it's super cool with what you're able to recreate look-wise from this. It's not perfect, and I want to talk about the improvements that could be made in the next video, but this is a very, very useful tool for those that need to get closer to a specific film profile. So now that we've actually tested out this tool and given you a bit of insight as to how it works, and you can see how powerful of a plugin this is, let's move on to the giveaway. If you're already sold and you don't fancy waiting about, the good news is you can get 10% off with my promo code PROPERHUES10 right now. So all you'll have to do is go stick it in at the checkout, save yourself a few quid, and you can start playing around with it. Or, you know, you could just sit there twiddling your thumbs, waiting on the giveaway like a numpty. Your choice. Right, on to the free stuff, because I know that's why half of you are still here. As I stated on my Instagram story, I have 3 lifetime licenses of Dehancer to give away and 5 one-year subscriptions for the iOS app, which I am super excited about. Being able to use this on an iPad, and more of us are starting to use DaVinci when it comes to iPad and monitoring our images on an iPad. Then being able to go ahead and use it on your iPhone, whether it's for video or stills, I think is a game changer. So I have 5 one-year subscriptions for the iOS plugin, but I'm not going to give it away all at once for free. I mean, where's the fun in that? This is going to be a proper little event, so we're going to start with round 1. Prizes for this week. I'm going to be giving away 1 lifetime license. That's going to mean it's yours forever. There's no subscriptions, no faff, just vibes. I'm either going to be giving away 1 or 2 one-year iOS subscriptions, depending on how much interaction we get with this video. If we get quite a lot, I'll probably do 2. If we're building into it, I'll just do the 1. But we're going to have 2 of those iOS subscriptions that we're giving away, so you can play around with all the tools and make your Instagram reels look sexy. And then the following week, I'm going to come back, test out Dehancer again, see if I can create something that's closer to film, maybe a black and white look, similar to the Robert Eggers Lighthouse look. I'm going to talk about some of the things that I don't like about Dehancer and some of the improvements that they can make with future iterations of this plugin. And then I'm going to have another giveaway for you. If you want to enter and you want to be a part of this giveaway, it's going to be dead simple. First and foremost, you're going to have to like this video and you're going to have to drop a comment below. Just tell me what film or scene you'd love to grade with the plugin. Simple as that, but you have to do both of them. You're also going to have to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because if you're not subscribed and you win, I'm just going to assume you don't like free stuff. because you have to follow the other rules to enter. Simple as mush. And if you want to double your chances, you can use my promo code ProperHues10 and DM me a screenshot and I'll chuck you in for an extra entry. Because if you're serious about your craft, 10% off is as much a better deal than just waiting around on the chances you win something for free. Or you could just wait there like a melon, entirely up to you. So that's going to be round 1. Winners are going to be announced in the next video where I'll be dropping the second giveaway. So if you don't win this one, don't be a sad bum, just enter again. And remember, if you want to jump the queue, Proper Hues at the checkout, sorted. Alright, cool. Chef Odd. Peace.